High pressure continues to cover most of the U.S., but the southern stream is becoming active. Major weather system in the Southern Rockies, and that will be moving out into the Gulf later this week. Looking at the world weather extremes, once again the Australian outback clocking in with the hottest temperature in the world, 109 at Urundagi. And that's a look at Urundagi. Yeah, I guess when you've seen one outback town, you've seen them all. And at the other extreme, Vanavara, Russia, down to minus 57. That's pretty far away from the usual cold pole areas, Oymyakon, Verkhoyansk. This is way out near Bratsk and the Trans-Siberian Railway. Do we have any imagery of Vanavara? Probably not. That's way out there in the sticks. Well, a couple of images there. So that's it, minus 57 this morning. Closer to home, the U.S. surface analysis shows a large stagnating polar high centered on the Midwest area, 1038 millibars, and then another separate high-pressure area across Idaho. This also represents a cold air mass that is slowly modifying. Here we have a developing weather system in Arizona. Upslope flow, isentropic lift, producing snow and rain in parts of the panhandles and eastern New Mexico. And we're going to see this come together over the next few days, and that will move into the Gulf region and across Florida. And we may see a round of severe weather in that part of the country. In the northeastern U.S., lake effect snows are persisting off of Lake Ontario. Some areas of New York, around Rome, Utica, Oswego, could see 2 to 6 inches of snow. That covers part of Interstate 90 between Oneida and the Mohawk area. Flood warnings persist in parts of New Hampshire, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. Looking at the Connecticut River, the Sudbury River, and Suncook River, the banks are swollen, and river conditions there are treacherous. Other than that, mostly dominated by cold advection cumulus. Those are cumuliform clouds. Strong air mass modification taking place as the cold air mass rolls out across the northeastern states, and that produces a unstable profile in the lowest 10,000 feet of the atmosphere. And just to show you what we're talking about, we can bring up a sounding, say around Albany, and there you can see steep lapse rates from the surface up to 10,000. So if you add any amount of moisture into the lowest part of the column, you will get convective clouds and possibly showers. And that's exactly what we're seeing out there off of the lakes. In the southeastern U.S., a frontal boundary from the Atlantic Ocean through the Bahamas. Some lift just north of that front, and showers around the Miami area. We are going to see conditions go downhill as we go into Saturday, a major weather system coming out of the Gulf. And we will see baroclinic development out there in the central Gulf on Friday. So there's that low-pressure area picking up that boundary, getting some upper-level support, and lifting to the northeast. Saturday evening could be pretty blustery and possibly some severe weather across Florida. Strong southeasterly winds, gale watches and warnings are in effect through much of the state into this weekend. And then going into Sunday, that low will track right up the coast, and we will see that have an effect on weather in the northeastern U.S. We'll cover more about that on Friday. In the Southern Rockies, a developing baroclinic weather system. This is a wedge of very warm air. You can see temperatures are almost 70 degrees there at Tucson, and up to Gallup, they're in the mid-50s, and that is pretty warm for this time of year. There's a look at the surface chart this afternoon. Front is banked up against the Sacramento and Davis Mountains. It looks like the front has actually passed Albuquerque. Cold conditions with easterly winds, that's going to be a classic indicator there of frontal passage, but not at Truth or Consequences and not at El Paso. Still rather warm there. Out to the east, though, cool conditions, upslope, adiabatic cooling, condensation, all of that producing some pretty bad weather, even some heavy showers in parts of the caprock. And there you can see the winter storm warnings. That's pretty well focused on the Clayton and Raton area and extends up to Trinidad, Walsenburg, Springfield, Boise City, and even Las Vegas, New Mexico. Those areas could get 8 to 16 inches of snow, but it does taper off to about 3 inches out there on the low plains. At least we're talking about the lower part of the plains around Boise City and Springfield. And this is a great view of the cloud field. The mountains are located right in here. You can see those clouds are pretty much pushed right up to the foothills and almost to the summits. Where the passes have been breached, such as through the Sandia Mountains into Albuquerque, the clouds do spill over onto the western side. So the cold front pretty much sitting about like this. And there's that easterly upslope flow covering much of this area. And where you see these convective cloud textures, there's likely showers reaching the ground. And looking further out towards the west, out around Flagstaff, Kingman, that's going to be an upper level low right there. Notice how the cloud pattern seems to spin in a counterclockwise fashion. Here's how it looks on the water vapor imagery. This is all going to be part of the warm conveyor belt, the dry slot working in from the southwest, and the upper level low located right there. Let's take a look at the upper air charts, and you can see how things stack up on the conventional charts. So at the surface, a weak low pressure area, 1014 millibars, around Holbrook and Gallup. At 850 millibars, we can see a vague low pressure area right there, centered on Arizona. At 700 millibars, about 10,000 feet, the low is pretty well defined. Definitely shows up at 500 millibars, about 18,000 feet, deep low pressure area. And at 300 millibars, about jet stream level, it's pretty much in the same area around the Grand Canyon. So what does that tell you? If you go back to my forecast books like the Weather Forecasting Handbook, Weather Analysis and Forecasting, and so on, that tells you that that is a cold core barotropic low. And basically that's an occlusion. That's an old frontal system that has occluded, and the central low pressure area has basically moved north of the temperature gradient. And when you look at the cyclone life cycle, that's going to represent the last stage, when the low pressure area has detached from the thermal gradient and moved back into the cold air. And you can see the thickness pattern indicating a pocket of cold air pretty close to the center, and that also implies the existence of a low pretty close to that low center in the upper levels. And looking at that thickness pattern, yeah, that's going to be thermal troughing right there underneath the upper level low. So, based on what we've seen, it is pretty well vertically stacked. Just the tiniest bit of tilt between the surface and the upper levels. So that is pretty well almost vertical. Going back up to 300 millibars near the top of the troposphere, looking at the North American weather pattern, this is going to be the main belt of prevailing westerlies. That's going to be the northern stream. The southern stream is pretty weak on the south side of that upper level low. And right off to the south, we can see a subtropical jet. And we know that's subtropical because we go up to 300 millibars, about 30,000 feet. Don't see very much right there. At 250 millibars, it starts to pick up a little bit. Then we go a little bit higher. And yeah, we're definitely seeing some activity. In fact, it eclipses the stuff out there in the southwestern U.S. So that is a subtropical jet. Now, we certainly have support for a polar front jet in this area right here because we've got that active frontal zone just to the south. But if we look at the cross sections in this area, well, let's start out on the East Coast, and there we do see a classic frontal transition zone. But heading further to the west, We start crossing onto the East Coast and then get into the southeastern U.S., and then the Gulf right down in this area. We can see that the thermal field, the isotropes, it's pretty flat. There is cold air in the lower levels, but no slope. Nothing that looks like a front, just kind of an inversion up there under 10,000 feet. Where the isotropes are sloped is in the upper levels. So this is actually responding to upper level convergence. And that's what's helping to support that subtropical jet right there as we get into Texas. Very little reflection down there below 300 millibars. Anyways, we head further to the west. We pick up that frontal system out there in the Rocky Mountains. This is not really a good way to be cross-sectioning it. We're going to take a look at it from east to west in just a minute. But yeah, you can see that activity right there. We can see the upper level low. If you look at the isotherms, the red lines, you can see them bumping up like that. That is a warm sink. The upper level low located right there in northern Arizona, right there. And very commonly, just above those lows, we get subsidence from the stratosphere. And you can see those isotropes bending down just a little bit above that low. Just to the south and southwest of that low, there's the polar front jet. That kind of rings the western and southern side. Then we get out to California. That pool of cold air across the Great Basin area goes away, and we get back into the tropical air mass on the west coast, but some cooler air down in the low levels. Let's take a look at the west to east cross-section. Take that up to Texas, and we see that frontal boundary. This is the shallow Canadian air mass. That's it, mostly down below 8,000 feet. And then on the other side, we've got the other Great Basin air mass right in there. So pretty much two different things going on. And this is the action area up there in eastern New Mexico, starting out around Carlsbad and heading up to Roswell. You can see all those clouds and all that moisture piled up there. And that's where we have the isotropic lift taking place. If we had a northwest to southeastern cross-section, I think that would show this a little bit better. But I don't have that set up yet. An upper level front out there on the west coast, pretty much in this area here. And we see the cold air mass pretty much right there over Arizona. You can see the isotherms bulging up into the stratosphere right there. So we're pretty close to that low pressure area. And there's the polar jet coming out of the page toward us on the west side. That's out over Las Vegas and Barstow. Let's head further north. Starting to get out of that precip field in Colorado and just into that cold air across Wyoming, Idaho. And then we get up towards the northern U.S. Things start to weaken in that part of the country, but still hanging on to this polar jet across the Great Lakes area. And curtains. So in the short term, the air masses are not going to move very much. We're still going to have that cold air banked up against the Rockies. So a lot of the weather tomorrow and on Friday will be moderated by the track of this upper level low and the associated dynamics and height falls. So going into tomorrow, we're looking at eastern New Mexico and west Texas in that area of upper level ascent. And then going into Friday, that we'll move out into the Dallas, Oklahoma City, Tyler, and Shreveport area. And then gradually we're going to see that low couple with this other system digging on the backside of that trough. And eventually we will get that cyclogenesis out there in the eastern Gulf for Saturday. And then these troughs will link up and head up towards the northeastern U.S. For our viewers who are more technically inclined, here's the Q vectors. The red areas, those are the important areas. Those indicate the potential for upward lift. So you can see that moving right there out ahead of the upper level low across Texas for Friday. And then two distinct centers, one out there in the Gulf. This appears to be a separate center, maybe along that front in the Gulf of Mexico, and then the old upper level low moving across Arkansas. So there's the big action area for Saturday, moving on up the coast for Sunday, and then into the northeastern U.S. And then going down to the surface, there comes our weather disturbance out of the Rockies and into Texas. By Friday, it will be convective. And you can see it pushing out there across Shreveport and Alexandria, Little Rock. And then we get the separate development down to the south on Saturday, affecting Florida pretty heavily for Saturday night, and then moving rapidly up the coast. On the west coast, a separate system. This is going to be a very closed-up low, so a lot of the precip and moisture will be kind of wrapping around to the west, but gradually we're going to get some of these bands coming into the state for Sunday and on into Monday. And then we're going to get a second system coming in from the Central Pacific for around Tuesday or Wednesday. That could come a little bit further south. And you can see with that, definite cold air advection, bringing that 540 line all the way down to Los Angeles. So I think there could be a little bit more snow than it shows here up in the higher elevations around Los Angeles, and certainly around Las Vegas as well. And that will cross the Rockies around the 21st, 22nd. And this is acting a little bit like a early fall system where, you get this development here and it goes up to the northeast. And we end up with mild weather in the southeastern U.S. However, this is a little bit too far out, so we're going to come back to this next week and see where we're at. A little bit of bonus material before we go. This is the situation in Europe yesterday. 1064 millibar high around Chelyabinsk and northern Kazakhstan. 1064 is pretty rare in the U.S. We see it during the coldest Arctic outbreaks around Montana, North Dakota, and that's really about it. It does show you the intensity of this high pressure area. I've got the temperatures in Fahrenheit, so running below zero. East of Moscow, looking at maybe 10 to 20 degrees there. And as we go into Europe itself, rather mild, 30s, 40s, and 50s. And I'll give you a quick look at the forecast. That high recedes and weakens, and then we start opening up some strong Atlantic flow across Europe and rather mild conditions going into the start of the Christmas holidays. Yeah, that's a very fast flow coming from the Atlantic. Let's take a look at Siberia. Cold air dispersed over much of the Siberian region, and then going towards the middle part of this month, a gradual warming trend from west to east, although at the very end of the period looks like some very cold air trapped in the valleys, so we could see some minus 60s and maybe even minus 70s start to reappear here in about a week. A little bit closer to home, looking at northern Canada, not really a whole lot of Arctic air, and if anything, it looks like maybe one little push into Quebec, a recharge for the 17th, and another push into Quebec. So we're not really getting much cold air going south like we commonly see in December and January. So any wintry cold weather will probably have to wait until January. And that will do it for this edition of Forecast Lab. I want to thank our newest Patreon supporters, Elizabeth Darden and Michael Hyman. Thank you very much for your support. And I do appreciate that support because it helps grow the channel. And when we hit our next growth milestone, we're going to do this 4 days a week instead of 3. And hopefully, maybe we'll get to a point where we can do this 5 days a week. We'll just have to see how it pans out. All right, hope you have a great rest of your Wednesday, and we'll see you back here on Friday for another edition of the program. Take care, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.